for compassion. And the topic today is the business of compassion. And it doesn't only mean that in order to participate in the business of compassion that you need to be part of a business. It could be any organization in which you are part. It could be a compassionate city group where you take yourself and get folks who are interested in some outstanding topic. So the field is wide open. And the whole idea behind Mindful Mornings came out of the head of Becky Crump. Mm-hmm. And she is the person who is here with us today. And I think that you're going to find her a very engaging person. And hence, I think that's what this whole process is about, that you engage with others. You challenge one another by listening to an outstanding person. All of this happens once a month and in various cities in which Becky has managed to bring the business of compassion and mindful mornings. And I think that what we're going to do is not take a whole lot of time with an introduction, because I think you're going to learn a lot from Becky herself. But just some reminders for people who are new to Zoom and the platform, or maybe you might have even forgotten. But there are two ways that you can communicate on Zoom while Becky is actually speaking. If you have a question for her, there is at the very bottom of your screen, if you use your cursor, you'll see Q&A. And if you just click on that, you'll be able to write in a question. Now, the other thing that you can do to the right of the Q&A icon is another one, which is the chat box. And when you go to the chat box, again, you could ask a question, but at the same time, you might just be commenting on what you're hearing from Becky. The other thing that you want to note is that on that chat box, you can see at the very end as you write your question, if you want that information that you're sharing to go to everyone who is on this call, or if you just want to send it directly to Becky. And I will interface with Becky throughout, but mostly after she finishes her presentation to let her know what's been going on while she was talking. So now I'm going to turn it over to Becky.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me. Quick disclaimer, I am in a beautiful, beautiful historic building in downtown Richmond, Virginia, which is where I live and work. This historic building has thin walls, and it also is surrounded by a train. Fun fact about Richmond, we are the only place in the country where there is a triple crossing of train tracks on top of one another, and it is directly outside my window. So if you hear a train coming, that's correct, you're hearing it. And if there's people in the room adjacent to me that are a bit loud because they're joyful and loving their meeting and getting excited, then let's just be grateful that they're having such a wonderful day. But if it conflicts with my talking, I wanted to bring it up. Another quick thing. So today is going to be much about a little bit about my story, and then much about what I've learned in engaging community in a more grassroots way in an effort to try to build a compassionate community here in Richmond and in other cities. So by the end of it, I hope that you know me a little bit better. I hope that you kind of like me too, quite honestly. And I hope that you've maybe learned a few things that you can take into your communities and into your effort, or share over dinner with someone who's trying to do the same thing. So as Marilyn mentioned, I am the founder of Mindful Mornings, and Mindful Mornings is an interactive speaker series that happens on the first Friday of every month in cities throughout the country, and we hope soon to be internationally too. This is a very new effort. It started a little over a year ago for me, and I'll kind of explain the background a bit later. But we only opened it to other cities around 3 or 4 months ago. So it's been really growing like wildfire. If I didn't mention, and I'm sorry for any redundancies as we talk, it is a volunteer effort. It's currently a volunteer effort for me too, although perhaps one day that will change, but it's certainly a volunteer effort on behalf of the chapter founders and the communities wherein it exists. And quite simply, our mission as chapter founders and as Mindful Mornings is to connect the people with the heart and soul to change the world with the content and community they need to make it happen. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to pull myself off of the screen so that you're not in conflict with my face, my face as it sits statically, my face as it is live and in color, and then also the words that I'm saying. And when we find ourselves at moments for question, of which there are 2 throughout the presentation, I'll pull my face back in so you can kind of feel as though we're engaging, even though unfortunately I can't see yours. And last kind of housekeeping thing, as Marilyn mentioned, she'll be fielding all of your thoughts and requests and questions, and we'll help surface those during that question time. But if you want to hang on to them, you're more than welcome, because again, there are 2 sections when you can ask, when you can raise a hand and ask questions. Okay, so let me take myself off of here, hide myself as it says, and then we will get rolling. Okay, so I wanted to begin by opening up with a little bit of a poll, and you can see my screen here. If for some reason you can't see my screen, you should be able to, so please let Marilyn know and she'll let me know. I'm curious if in the poll function or in the chat function probably is the correct term for it, if you could answer this question: what is your do-gooder mission? Do-gooders, in Mindful Mornings, we call every attendee who comes a do-gooder. And whether they feel that way or whether we want them to live into that feeling, it's a term that we use universally. And we always ask people when they come, what's your do-gooder mission? So if you could take a second and type that in to the chat feature, that would be fantastic. I won't address them now, but I will address them later. And I'm quite curious to know more about what each of you are working on. My do-gooder mission, quite simply, is to give to the world more than I take from it by uniting, again, the people with that intrinsic desire to help the world with all that they need to make it happen. So my do-gooder mission is much in part Mindful Mornings mission, which happens when you start a company, right? Typically, it is your mission that you are hoping to bring to life. I'll give you a quick second. So before I dig into how it runs and why it works and where it's happening and all of those fun things about Mindful Mornings, I want to share a bit about me, because I actually think it's quite a common story, but one that is often, all too often felt and not shared, and then also not really focused, right? Felt, but not focused. So I want to share a little bit about my background and how I arrived at Mindful Mornings. And yes, that is a giant reindeer on the wall, which always makes the photographs for these forums at this particular location quite interesting, because my face is often right at the reindeer's nose. There's me as a young kid. I was clearly a little bit of an ornery child, but I was a joy, right? So my earliest memories of childhood were really intense. They were dramatic, they were scary, they were kind of upsetting, quite honestly. I was a very passionate child, but not particularly a very joyful child. My earliest memory that I have, in fact, to speak to this intensity is of my grandmother passing away. Other memories that stick out in my mind include horrifying night terrors, that I was plagued by each evening, a deep concern for what comes next after we die, an aching for the world that was generally kind of inexplainable to a young little girl and quite frightening. I even had an intense fear of sharks. So the funny part about this is I lived in Dallas, Texas, and so I wasn't actually known for its wild shark activity. But I had from shark attacks to global warming, to pollution, to kidnapping, noting that I was born in the mid-'80s, and so there was a big surgence of kidnapping scares around that time. But to kidnapping, to child hunger, to racial injustice, I felt it all and worried about it all the same. I actually recall hurriedly and emphatically turning a little boy away because he came up to me after school one day to talk to me about the recent recycling initiative at our elementary school and the impact on the environment. And it was interesting, his memories just kind of burned in my brain, but I turned him away because I knew I couldn't handle it. The worry I held for our collective fate on the planet was just too strong, right? Too strong. I didn't want to know. My mother would run her car in parking lots. I'd always reach over and turn it off. There was trash on the street. It was my job to pick it up. I couldn't even walk past it without thinking, oh, no, I have to turn around. If a kid was getting bullied at school, that was something I addressed too, regardless the age, and that extended through high school, where bullying was a little bit more prominent than it was when I was younger. I wondered about church. I questioned the truth of its teachings. I wondered if people were paying attention to the words or if they were just going through the motions. I felt tensions of racism, so I wrote letters or incited conversations about inclusivity with my classmates when I was, I think 10 years old was the first time that happened. It was not received particularly well. I was made fun of significantly, but I just felt this tension and really wanted to address it and be clear of my own personal beliefs and views of mutuality and equality. I'd weep for fallen animals. I'd wonder at the homeless, and I was convinced that bad things were happening in the world and that bad things could happen to me, and they likely would, because my life was just too awesome and balance had to be struck. So needless to say, there was a lot of intensity. Now, I don't want to tell you all of this and you think, oh my gosh, she must have had a horrible childhood. I actually had wonderful parents. I had two loving, beautiful sisters. I'm smack in the middle. I was just born very intense. I was just born with a lot of worry. I was born feeling the burden of the world, and I was born with the inability to unsee what was happening for any period of time. And certainly that meant that I was a little more intense and slightly less joyful. I was happy. I just wasn't, terribly joyful as a child, if that makes sense. And I can take questions on that later too. As I mentioned, I grew up in the suburbs of Dallas to two former Marines. I believe if anybody's in the military on the call, you were never an ex, but always a former. So hopefully I got that right. My dad was actually a commercial pilot for Southwest Airlines, and my mother stayed home with me and my two sisters after she left the Marines. And we were the epitome of the wonderful, healthy, middle-class family. So I often wondered about all the angst, and that's what didn't make sense. And since it didn't make sense, and I wasn't seeing the same concern or worry in my peers, I assumed there was something wrong with me, right? That this just wasn't, these weren't kind of correct feelings to have. And I start my story like this because, again, I feel like it's a really common one that people don't talk about. I most especially, although we're in a space now where kids can talk about it more, I most especially feel like we don't allow our children, of which I have 5, to talk about their concerns and worries, and the worries they maybe think are strange even, more kind of loosely and broadly in conversation. And I don't think as parents we get inquisitive enough about that too. So we kind of wait for our children to come toward us with something, as opposed to say, tell me the deepest and darkest, tell me the worries that you have, tell me the things that you're joyful for too, right? All of that. So when you're a young kid, if you think there's me circled, there's my younger sister kissing my cousin and my older sister, and just a hodgepodge of families in the back of a truck, as one does in Dallas in the 80s. But when you're a young kid, you think you're different than everyone in really kind of odd ways. You keep it to yourself, as I mentioned, you bottle it up. You most certainly don't share it with friends or family. So that's what I did. I internalized, ruminated, and the cycle kind of continued until about my sophomore year in high school, when I found a wonderful tool to turn my attention away from all of the trauma that I felt kind of stirring inside and externally in the high school environment, as some of you may know or may have experienced. And that's when eating disorders entered my life. So from 16 until about 22, I struggled with many different types of eating disorders, each being a coping mechanism. This is why I mentioned them. I'm not totally taking a tangent. I mentioned them because they were a tool for me to unsee the world, if that makes sense, to kind of go to sleep a little bit more than I was. And it's a tactic that worked in that way. It was terribly harmful in others, but it did work in the way that allowed me to hyper focus on one thing and block out the noise of other things that maybe were less pleasing, said quite generally. So in my early 20s, I started seeing a counselor, and I recall with vivid detail sitting on her white couch while she sat in this kind of rolling black chair atop a plastic square mat that was used to clearly kind of protect the integrity of the carpet. She spoke to me of the pains of living a life awakened, where we see the beauty and we see the horror and we see the sadness. And she framed for the first time my eating disorder as a coping mechanism to unsee. And in that moment, I knew she was right. And the interesting thing is I'd spent countless sessions wondering, with counselors looking at me saying, different than her, saying, well, what happened to you in your childhood that caused you to be this way, right? What abuse or what injustice or what happened? There must have been something that triggered you into these eating disorders. Was your mother obsessed with dieting? Was your, question after question? And the answer continually was, no, life was really good. Life was really, in fact, great. If I had to paint a better picture of a life, I don't know what I would paint. Maybe more beaches would be in it, but otherwise, no, nothing. And perhaps not even that because of my shark fear. So when this one woman said that this was my ability to cope and to unsee, that's when I knew what I had used eating disorders for, and that it wasn't born from a specific trauma. It was born from a wrestling with and a not knowing what to do with that wrestling with. So from then on, I chose to kind of slowly wake back up. I did it incrementally and over time by taking on sustainability initiatives at work. I volunteered at my local farmer's market. I mentored a young boy whose father was incarcerated. I tried to pay attention to where I felt like I was being called and where I felt my passions were and follow those and see what manifested. All the while, I was deploying my degree in marketing and communications from Virginia Commonwealth University, which is actually here in Richmond, in the fields of sales and business development. So that was one of my first jobs, commission-only sales, video production and creative direction, marketing direction, culture and communications consulting. So like organizational transformation inside large companies, Fortune 50s to 500s, and more, voice talent work being amongst them. I worked for huge organizations and I worked for small startups. I helped create marketing materials to better sell cigarettes inside convenience stores. And I also traipsed local farms trying to secure new local vendors for the organic grocer that employed me as their marketing director. My jobs ranged from the more mission-driven, as you can hear, to the absolutely missionless, even the harmful, as you can see indicated by the job selling cigarettes inside convenience stores through multimedia materials. And all the while, as this is happening, I'm earning health coaching certifications because of my my kind of issues with diet and eating and kind of healthful lifestyle. The way that I addressed that was to learn more about it, was to understand the context. And so I threw myself into a health coaching certification. And I also threw myself post that certification into a master's degree in clinical integrative nutrition. Not that I intended on working inside hospital systems, but I just wanted all the science, all the biochemistry, all the organic chemistry, all the anatomy, as much as it pained me, and it did. I needed the context, and I wanted to be able to share that with others. And also a large part why I focused on nutrition is because I knew that without a doubt that what we put in our mouths was at the core of some of the biggest issues of our time. And that if I wanted to make a difference, I wanted to focus on something that would impact a lot of things. And that for me looked like changing what people would choose to eat. Okay, so we're fast forwarding a lot of years from this picture on the back of a truck, a red pickup truck in Texas, to maybe 3 years ago or something like this. So about 2.5, 3 years ago, whilst I was working for the company that was creating adverts for a large tobacco manufacturer, I decided that my community here in Richmond, Virginia, needed an event focused on nutrition. I was so excited about this. And like a lot of things I do in my life, I get excited, I throw it out there in the world, and then I just see what happens, and I push it and drive it and try to, make it a reality. So I thought, okay, great, Becky, what you're going to do is you're going to pull in New York Times bestselling authors, national experts, local advocates. You're going to call it the River City Health Summit, which is what we call Richmond, the River City. We were voted the best river town in the United States about a year or two ago by Outside Magazine, and it's an honor we're quite happy for, and I'm lucky enough to live very close to the river, so I can paddleboard and all of that stuff. So we'd call it the River City Health Summit. I'd buy the URL, gethealthyrichmond.com, and naming things and buying URLs, I have to tell you all, is admittedly one of my guiltiest of pleasures. And then everyone would want to pay $75 for this one-day event filled with insights and aha moments. Right? This was absolutely the case, right? I marketed this thing everywhere. As I mentioned, I have 5 daughters. So please believe that we were all canvassing business communities and sticking flyers on doors. As I come home, I look at them and I think, there's a lot of you. There's a lot of sets of hands. You're pretty good helpers. All right, get in the car. We're getting put to work. I was also getting free ad placement in local media. I negotiated radio interviews with the keynote talent who were in fact New York Times bestselling authors, like Joe Robinson being one, and appeared on partner blogs, secured sponsorship with local health systems and national organizations. I was doing it all right, and I was doing it all by myself, aside from my child canvassing efforts. But guess what? The whole thing was a bust, a complete and utter bust. Like most lessons learned, they come from moments of failure, which is, I know, an old adage that is true, although for some reason it never really provides that much solace in the moments when we're failing, does it? But, hindsight is 20/20, and perspective is an important thing to keep. So this was one of those moments of failure. For a few days, I felt sorry for myself for being what I considered a loser, right? And then I started to wonder why the event didn't work. I came home to my kids the night that I realized I was going to have to shut it down. It had 45 people had signed up, but it needed 75 to break even. There were keynote expenses and travel expenses. And so I had to kind of eat a significant number of those fees. But I remember coming home to my children, and they'd written me sweet cards saying, "You're great. We love you. You're not a failure. You're still our mom. Everything's going to be great. Don't worry," which was really, really sweet. But then after I kind of got over myself a little bit, I started to ask myself some questions. I started to wonder why the event didn't work. Was it price point? Was it promotion? Was it the speakers? Was it me? Okay. After much deliberation internally and socializing these questions with honest people in my network, I arrived at an answer that changed the trajectory of my life, quite honestly. I had assumed a community of people wanted this type of nutrition knowledge here in Richmond. I assumed that this community existed, that they were just waiting for the opportunity to sit in a room and experience this content. And I assumed all of this without asking any of them. Not without asking my community at all, just with assuming, and I assumed it was true. In the age of entrepreneurs, innovation, design thinking, human-centered design, UX and more, we know better than I did then of the paths we need to take to ensure whatever we're selling is actually either wanted, needed, or both. I sat with that for some time without a clear next step, quite honestly. I just realized the error of my ways. And so I pivoted my attention back to work as a consultant for Fortune 50s to 500s in that organizational transformation role. The problem for me at this point, and this is why this is a really pivotal point for me, not only because of the failure, because of realizing that you can't assume what your community needs without talking to your community and asking them honestly what they need, and not just the community that loves you, but the community you don't know, maybe the community that doesn't love your effort. But this was pivotal for that reason. It was also pivotal because I realized going back into work that my role no longer felt as rewarding, because I realized how void it was of a mission focus. And in many ways, how harmful the work was. And it's shocking to me what we're able to justify as human beings. And it's shocking what I was able to quite honestly justify. But I was. So I go back to work, and I'm not necessarily the same person because my eyes have been slightly opened. I'm a little bit more awake than I was when it began. And even though slightly bruised, have realized some answers that will fuel the next part of my journey. So I started building again. This time I did it by testing the market before I built the platform, which is always the route that you should go. But 3 years ago, I didn't realize that that's what I should do. With my master's in root and my health coaching certification in tow, I started giving keynotes on wellness to corporations and associations with the hope that there would be an outpouring of interest for workplace wellness programs that were more lasting and sticky, not this kind of spaghetti against the wall approach, ones that truly addressed long-term behavior change. So I go out on this keynote tour, and this is me in this picture giving one for, I believe, American Airlines. And there was others for a lot of associations, which is interesting because I realized in my journeys how many associations there are in the world. And I think the pinnacle of that realization was when I gave a keynote for the Association for Associations. And I thought, okay, there's a ton. This country here in the United States, at least, might be built on associations. So I go out and I test this model. I test this idea of kind of robust, lasting, sticky workplace wellness programs. And whereas the keynotes were a great success, the response to building these programs inside corporations was another resounding no. So at this point, I've racked up 2 big no's, and this effort to build this keynote and to build what I imagined the process would look like for workplace wellness programs was months and months and months and months of effort. The issue was a little bit different, however. It wasn't that wellness programs weren't launching in companies left and right, and Silicon Valley wasn't kicking out tech company after tech company to address this kind of growing demand, or this the fever around this question of how do we create well, healthy places to work where engagement and attraction and retention are all high. It wasn't that, right? The market said, yes, these things are needed. It was that my employer at the time wanted to value the work at a rate not mirrored by the market, quite honestly, one that more closely aligned with our consulting work, which was extremely expensive. And that just didn't make sense. People weren't willing, Fortune 50s weren't willing to pay the same rate for organizational transformation work, so culture work, as they were for a wellness program. But my firm at the time that I worked for really wanted to charge that rate. And that just wasn't, that wasn't going to fly. So this question started to swirl around in my mind, and it continued. Oh, excuse me, sorry, y'all. That's my cell phone. And it continues regularly even to today. I constantly am wondering, what's mine to do? What's mine to do? Sometimes I journal about it. Sometimes I wonder. Sometimes I have very clear answers, and they last for mere months. And then I wonder again, what's mine to do? And I think it's a really healthy question for all of us to wrestle with. But I was at this time, after the Health Summit and after the workplace wellness, it was me trying to get after my purpose. I was thirsty for it. I was ready to take my awakening, right, to that kind of seeing the world that I had done when I was younger, but didn't know what to do with it. I was better equipped to know what to do with it now, and I wanted to take it to another level. I was ready to see the world's problems, to show up and take action, and I wanted to answer this question, what's mine to do? And I wanted that answer to focus on creating a more well world in whatever way made sense for me based on skills and passions and the needs of the community. So I reflected on both the workplace well-being failure, the Health Summit failure, and the success of all my keynotes for associations, of which, again, there are just thousands of associations. And I also reflected on the silos that I saw in Richmond in the social good space. And I asked myself a few really important questions. And these are actually really important questions, and likely some that many of you ask yourselves. If you don't, I would encourage you to. And if you do, but you've never framed it like this, I would encourage you to write them down and share it with your friends and your family and your employees and your colleagues all the same, so that they can have some pointed questions to answer too that are helpful. I stumbled upon them over a series of years, but it would have been great if someone just asked me right initially. Question number one, what are my skills? What are my skills? What am I good at? And it doesn't have to be tactical. I often talk to young professionals and I say, listen, you all want to think about your skills as creative writing, or you want to think about your skills as social media management, or you want to think about your skills as finance. But there are other skills, some might call them superpowers, that aren't necessarily tactical work skills. Maybe you're deeply compassionate. Maybe you're incredibly kind. Maybe you're a listener who really has the ability to attend to someone deeply. Maybe you're incredibly insightful and you notice that you can uncover the next steps for people in ways that they can't uncover for themselves. Whatever those skills are, what are they? Right? Just list them out. So that was question one for me. What are my skills? Question two for me was, where do my passions lie? Where do my passions lie? What am I passionate about? What, when I think, said another way, and I've read this in a book, of course, I can't remember the name now because they start to kind of blur together, don't they? But I read this in a book, and it said, you're working on a problem that is your problem to address when your heart starts to beat faster when you think about it. And it's a wonderful way to frame where do my passions lie, or to let us not necessarily frame it, but to understand or to be able to answer that question, where do my passions lie? Because when you start to journal and you start to consider, when your heart starts to beat a little bit faster, maybe a lot a bit faster, then you realize that that's a place, that's something for you to dig into. So that's question number two. Question number three, and this is a big one. I tell this to entrepreneurs, and I also tell this, whether social or otherwise. And then I also tell this to my nonprofit folks and my volunteer folks in my community and myself. But the third portion that's really important that I didn't do with the Health Summit was, what needs do I see in the community? What needs do I see in the community, or what needs exist in the community? Said another way, right? Because just because I see them doesn't mean they are true. We see a lot of things through rose-colored glasses. So what needs exist in the community? That way you know that you're solving a pain point, right? Or an opportunity. Oftentimes I'll find people that have decided to follow their passions into a company without checking the need, which is obviously wrong. And then or ill-advised, or following their passions into creating a company, and the needs exist, but they actually don't have the skills to be a CEO. And so that's not necessarily a role they should lead for a long time, which we understand intimately in the startup space often happens. Most founders don't remain the CEO once they get some type of growth beneath them. Number four, the fourth question, what's the minimum viable product that would be an alignment of the three? So that's the fourth question I ask myself. And not everybody has to use the kind of MVP, minimum viable product language, but I do, because I had to work. I had a job, right? I had a ton of kids. I still have a ton of kids, thankfully. I was in my graduate program. So I'm thinking, okay, I've got skills, passions, I see needs of the community, but I can't just go out there and fund some new venture. So what's the minimum viable product that would address these three things, that would be in alignment of these three? And then number five, and what's reasonable and achievable within the framework of my life as a mom, full-time employee, and graduate student that can also scratch that itch of creating a more well world. So those were the five things that I asked myself as I considered post these kind of what some might call failures. I think just huge lessons of learning. I even consider my eating disorders a terrible gift because of how much it taught me. So the answer, interestingly, was another question. I want to bring this up. Dear Tooth Fairy, I was wondering, like I always do, and I thought maybe you could raise my dollar amount After all, this tooth was a very painful tooth to pull. I think this is so funny because it speaks to not only my young girl ability as a child to really wonder. I wondered. We all wondered when we were little kids, didn't we? We were great at wondering. Wondering was maybe all that we did. And then I also think it's funny because it was a little bit of foreshadowing about my kind of entrepreneurial spirit as I'm trying to engage in some slight negotiation with the tooth fairy about raising my dollar amount, which I think is a trip. The interesting thing about this wondering is that oftentimes after early childhood, it gets slightly lost, doesn't it? You know, we stop wondering. And then at some point in our lives, like probably many of you on this call, because of being engaged with the Charter for Compassion, no doubt, you start wondering again. You know, I'd call it, I don't like to call it curiosity because I think wonderment is a better word for it. I think curiosity doesn't necessarily take us to the depth that wonderment takes us to. So I started to ask myself the question, what if, which I'm now incredibly comfortable asking. I ask all the time, maybe sometimes to a fault. I thought, what if I created a safe space and place where the people with the heart and soul to change the world, let's call them do-gooders, could unite and gain access to the content and community they need to see that change actualized? What if? What if I was the MC and we'd have a keynote speaker at each one? What if announcements were surfaced so people could better understand what's happening in the community and they could help one another? What if food, coffee, and kombucha were provided? What if it was only 1 hour once a month? What if it were free? And then I asked myself, and what if it could be built in a way that allowed its seamless growth throughout the world? That it could be almost rinse and repeat in a fashion, right? And scale and be more impactful because of that growth. So from these failures and these questions and these wonderings, Mindful Mornings was born with the intention to create more compassionate communities by inviting all of us, me included, to wake up to our surroundings, to become mindful of our communities and of one another, and to be mindful of our communities and one another in a way that asks us to not only take notice, but if there's a soul resonance, to take action, right? Okay, so here's some photos of my forums. You'll notice that these are in Richmond. You'll appreciate probably that this is in a furniture store, which is actually a wonderful place to hold events because it's already set up for you. So I think we don't think about furniture stores because there's tags, as you can see on the back of the chairs. But it was a wonderful place for the venue because it was so eclectic. Word of caution, have general liability insurance because the tables that these men and women are sitting at with their glass kombuchas are, you know, an exorbitant amount of money. So I would start each forum and say, okay, don't break anything, right? Like this is all for sale. If you spill coffee on one of these leather chairs, they're never going to let us back. So here's some photographs of the forum, and I'll talk a little bit about the format. Wonderful people just convening and uniting and discussing and sharing. And this is in Atlanta. And I'll tell you the cities that we have later. If you have a question about that, I can return to it. So the format is basic. As I say about Mindful Mornings, it's simple. And I have just a few more notes and then we're going to question and answer. So I want you all to realize that my monologue is soon closing before the first question and answer. So the format is as follows. The doors open at 8 a.m. Keynote begins by 8:20, so the speaker takes the stage at 8:20. Announcements are made by about 9:05, so the community, the audience is asked, they get 30 seconds, and I say, share something you need help with or a way in which you can help others, and I quite simply and plainly tell them there's no soliciting allowed, and if you have questions, you can ask me. One of the things that people love the most about Mindful Mornings is that unlike a networking event, people come to give, not to take, if that makes sense, right? So there's a level of generosity and kindness. They're not there to advance in their career in any capacity. They're not there to try to find sales leads. They're not there for anything other than the fact that they are thirsty for like mission to community based on soul set not mindset, which I can talk more about. And then everybody's out of there by 9:15. So you could arrive at 8:20, see the keynote, and get out of there by 9:15. I'm a business person by nature, as you've probably been able to discern. So I like to keep things fast, right? In each forum, we talk about issues, ideas, organizations, and that when are addressed or when supported or when are encouraged will create a more well world. So within that framework, topics range from homelessness to education, to refugee reestablishment, to compassion, to social entrepreneurship. And one of the unique things about Mindful Mornings, which is really cool and really appreciated, is that we never announce the speaker. We only ever announce the theme. So 100, and let's speak to Richmond, for example, 160, 70 people join at every one with a wait list of around anywhere between 50 and 100 people. And they don't even know who's going to talk. That's how desperately they want to be together. And that's how interested they are in being attentive in the present moment to content without expectation. I think it's just really, it's something for me that's just terribly beautiful about what we do. Quickly, before we go into kind of questions, I want to mention why we use the word mindful, but we don't talk about mindfulness, which some of you may have noticed up to this point. So that's a great question if you're asking it in your mind or if you've typed it. The word mindful to me addresses taking notice of the way in which we show up in support of our communities and the way in which we show up in support of one another. Mindfulness is the way in which we show up and relate to the internal environment, with external implications. So what we do talk about at Mindful Mornings is how important mindfulness is in cultivating self-compassion so that we can create compassionate communities, if that makes sense. But we don't consider mindfulness ours to do, right? So I have a lot of partnerships with people who are in that space and really focused and educated and trained and all of that. And I bring them in advance of Mindful Mornings beginning, or perhaps even at the close, to do Qigong, to do Nia, to do sound concerts, to do guided meditations. We just never put it within that framework of an hour, right? So we invite people to come 15, 20 minutes early or to stay 15, 20 minutes late. And since we only have an hour, you can imagine that we have to work pretty quickly. So mindful is also used because that's how we want people to show up on these first Fridays of every month. We want them to show up with their attention toward one another and toward the moments, each moment that exists within that hour. Okay, so this is no new model, right? Oh, let me mention this. This is at VCU, which is Virginia Commonwealth University. So we've started running Mindful Mornings at universities. I'm a business person, so this is for the School of Business, and the point of Mindful Mornings at VCU is to essentially introduce students to two things. One is the concept that doing good is a non-negotiable, right? Regardless of what they choose to do for work, that doing good is something that has to be a part of their life. And then the second is that there's a lot of ways to get at it. It doesn't necessarily look like the things Instagram shows you. It doesn't necessarily look like the things you see on the news or the things that your friends are doing. Doing good lives on a continuum of kindness and compassion to others, to something far more dramatic. And so we have, it's this, as opposed to this being speakers that come in, it's a panel, one speaker, it's a panel discussion that I moderate. And through these individuals on the panel, students are able to see the way in which other adults and businessmen and women get at doing good and making money. So this is a Mindful Mornings at VCU. This is a Mindful Mornings, as I say, for grownups. Another, just to give you a sense of the crowd. Of course, you can't see behind that. This is another in Atlanta. And this is not necessarily new, right? You could go back to the Masons. You could go back to Rotary. You could talk about 1 Million Cups. You could talk about Eventbrite being a forum to a platform created to allow for things like this to happen. BNI, Creative Mornings, Vistage. I mean, this is, 6 or 7 of hundreds of opportunities for people to get together. And all of them are great. You could talk about the American Marketing Association or the Public Relations Society or whatever. What I had started to notice, however, when creating this was that much in part, there wasn't something for people based on who they are, not what they do, right? It wasn't about being an entrepreneur. It wasn't about being a creative. It wasn't about being in marketing. It wasn't about being in a particular industry. It was just, do you have the intrinsic mission to make the world a better place? Then let's join together and let's try to figure out how we make it happen, right? So now we have 10 chapters with more coming online in the very near future. And we only began this journey of welcoming in new chapters just a few short months ago. So they're coming on very quickly. As an N of one, I'm working feverishly to get everybody up and running. But that's where we are currently. So I think this is probably a really good time to break for questions. Marilyn, I don't know if you want to field them for me. I don't know if we can take all of them or how many we have, but.
Okay, that sounds good.
Great.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. Here's me again. Hey, everyone.
Okay. What have been some of your most impressive mindful mornings?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to tell you the ones that have been most impressive to my audience, and I'll tell you the themes. So the most recent was, and the train's coming by again. I should walk you all out there so you can see. It's really impressive. Speaking of impressive, it's quite impressive itself. But the most recent one was on social entrepreneurship, was one of the themes, and that was really well attended. And also the line for the speaker was wild afterward. I mean, in fact, I had to start fielding emails for him because it got so out of control. However, let me say that he spoke about the brokenness of our education system in the United States. So he talked about social entrepreneurship from a frame of, you don't necessarily have to start a nonprofit or a business to make a change, to make a difference. He did, and he did make a difference. And then he realized where he could make the biggest difference was inside a university, trying to change the way students experienced their education journey. And whereas it was slower to move and less exciting, it was really meaningful. So his call out was to say, don't necessarily go for the shiny new object. Government needs you. Universities need you. Try to find places you can insert yourselves in those areas. And the last thing I'll say about that is I think the reason it was so well liked is because a lot of people feel that pain about education. And he's the director for the Da Vinci Center here locally, has also struggled with dyslexia all of his life. So he spoke a lot about learning disabilities too. And so that was one that really resonated. Another one that really resonated was one on one on poverty and one on homelessness. And they were very interconnected and done back to back. But they talked about, and all across all of the chapters, talked about homelessness and poverty within each city and what the levels are, whether they're rising, what we can do about it as a community. So we try to be very action oriented at the end. Like, if you feel called, here's what you can do. And then I think the last one that was really impactful was on the theme compassion. So you have one of my chapter in Asheville, North Carolina, the gentleman opened and he said, he played a scenario and he said, imagine that the person next to you just experienced this terrible trauma. Without using words, I want you to show them empathy and show them compassion. And so the fascinating thing is everybody ended up hugging each other. So for 3 minutes, they sat there holding one another. The pictures are, if you follow Mindful Mornings Asheville, you can see the photographs. But the pictures are wild. And so they just sat there and held one another for 3 minutes. So those were some of the best and brightest, although they're all pretty awesome.
That sounds great.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question here, but the question is easily answered. And one of the people came in late, who I believe is on phone line, and wanted to know if we would be able to replay this. And the answer is definitely yes. There's going to be two ways. One is we forgot to mention that we have gone live on Facebook. So if you went to the Charter Facebook page, you would be able to find this conversation with Becky. The other is once this recording is complete, in a day or so, we will send out a link for the recording. So you'll have two ways to come back and hear the material. Catherine Van Oom wants to know, do you have facilitators for audience involvement? And actually, she has a series of questions here. I'm just going to throw them all out at you, and you can respond. How do you fund these events? What tool for registering do you use? And what cities are involved already?
Hi, Catherine. Thanks for all the questions. I'm imagining that you're saying hi back to me out loud. So facilitators for interactive components of the forum. Good question. The chapter founder, so each city has a chapter founder, excuse me, and that chapter founder acts as the kind of MC and the facilitator. So the one thing you bring up is that people are really keen on the forums being interactive. So what they don't want to do is just kind of sit and be spoken to. Not all of them want to hug each other for 3 minutes. Okay, I think that was kind of uniquely a Nashville thing. I feel that if in Richmond we did that, I would likely have not gotten the same result from everyone. But the interactive moments are really important. But it's the chapter founders that facilitate those moments, and they get to decide how they want to do it at their chapter. The speaker can also do it, creating more of an experiential keynote, like the one gentleman did, where he actually prompted that hugging in the beginning. In regards to funding, that's also a brilliant question. We don't have any right now, quite honestly. And so this is much a grassroots movement that has no money behind it. And I know that sounds probably a little wild. And I think that I'm a person who believes things should be valued and that there should be an exchange of money at some point. I also know that, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I also know that I want the forums to be equitable, and I also know that I want them to be available, and I also know that that my plan for Mindful Mornings looks like Mindful Mornings founder chapters being free, the forums being free, but that other things being kind of monetized down the road potentially to support its growth. And the chapter founders, it's a volunteer effort. So right now it's a volunteer effort for all of us. And the founders spend about 12 to 15 hours a month until they get a team. So when my Charleston chapter founder started, she had like 55 people come to her first one with a wait list of 15. And I told her immediately after when she sent that email, the follow-up email, I said, ask for volunteers. They're obviously engaged. They like what you're doing. You had a good crowd. Diversify the workload now as much as you can, because if you wait 6 to 10 months to ask for volunteers, they'll say, well, my gosh, but Emily's been doing such a great job. She doesn't really need volunteers. This thing's clearly been running without her, right? Even if they consider wanting to help. So we try to pull teams in around us that support us so that we can kind of reduce the hours. But I was talking to Marilyn and Mimi before the call began, and the thing that chapter founders like about this so much is that it's one volunteer effort, so they can focus their energy on one thing, but it hits a lot of things, if that makes sense. So it's one volunteer effort, but they can learn about homelessness in their city, but they can understand what's happening as far as trafficking is concerned. And then they can shine, they can be the kind of person that shines a light on these things through the forum. And then the last question was about registering, and I do it through Eventbrite. So everybody works through Eventbrite in the same Eventbrite account. So Mindful Mornings, this is getting in the weeds, but I wonder if you're an event organizer or something and you'd like to know, but we all work in the same Eventbrite account. We all work in the same MailChimp account, that they're just given some type of manager access.
Okay, great. I just wanted to let you know we have only 5 minutes left. But there are a couple other questions, and I know that there are people who are on the phone who can't write out their questions. And I think maybe you've already answered this indirectly. But how do people contact you? And do you have a reporting arm for Mindful Mornings, like a blog or a newsletter?
That's great. So the newsletters are handled by each chapter founder. You can reach out to me at Becky@mindfulmornings.org, which I'll throw up at the end of our chat here in just a couple of minutes. But mindfulmornings.org is the website. You can see all of the chapters too on there, which is great. So we've got places like Springfield, Ann Arbor, Atlanta, Asheville, Burlington, Vermont, Virginia Beach, Richmond, Charleston, South Carolina. So there's more. And we are actively, just so all of you know, welcoming new chapters. So if you or someone you know would like to start a chapter in their town, I envision a world where we look at 170 of these things and we say, oh my gosh, we have now created and united this do-gooder brigade who want to kind of focus their time and energy and attention on trying to make the world a better place. And we can find ways to nourish and nurture and, again, provide them not only one another, but the content that they need to make it happen.
You know, this is a great opportunity for people who might be on the call, but also an extended opportunity for our Compassionate City initiatives because they can actually be the originators in their cities to get something like this going. There's another question here about how do you know that that action actually occurs because of Mindful Morning presentation?
I don't. This is 2.0. So one of the things about kind of the lean startup model is to make sure you understand what your community needs and start to work on that minimum viable product. The next thing is, how do we know? Right? How do we understand what's happening beyond asking for stories? Then each chapter founder feels like, oh my gosh, I connected with this person and I did this and now we do that. Right now, it's a lot of trust and faith that something is happening, and that even if nothing is happening in a way that's really kind of tangible, that says now this thing increased 30% because of this, uniting at this forum, that the space in that room and the awareness is incredibly important. So I like to say that the results also live on a continuum, right? Where if you, and I tell this to my crowd, I say, if you go out and talk about this tonight at dinner, that's a win, right? That's a win. If you decide to give, all of your savings and, invest all of your time and do, whatever for this mission, that's also a win. Right? There's a lot, this doing good, again, lives on this continuum. And I don't want people to think it's all or nothing. It can actually be conversations over dinner where things are socialized. And I want to mention one thing before you guys part, because I think it's helpful, if you don't mind. Y'all can email me if you want to know more or talk to me a little bit about it. But I want to run you through a few quick things. It's going to take me 60 seconds. Okay. The reason the community organizing has been successful, because I venture to guess some of you are community organizers, is there's several reasons. I'm going to list them. It's by a person, not a company. So when we think about some of the strongest social movements throughout time, I won't go through all the names, you can call people to mind. It was typically in person. It wasn't typically a person connected to an organization. And I think that it's not to say it's impossible in either way, but I think that's what's really important about Mindful Mornings. It's not the local nonprofit starting it, although the person that works at the local nonprofit might start it, right? But it's not an arm of a business. It is its own thing, which allows it to be very genuine. Diverse and inclusive community is intentional. So I move the forums around the city all over the place, and the other chapter founders do too. I also work with minority-owned businesses. There's a lot of ways that we try to make this, we make it free for all to come. We recognize do-gooders through the Do-Gooder Award series. Like, there's a lot of things that we do to make sure that we are getting the Mindful Mornings community to look like the bigger community in which we live. And that has to be intentional, right? If a yoga instructor starts it and invites all of his or her friends, you're going to have a forum for yoga instructors, which is wonderful. I love yoga. I'm a huge fan, but we want it to be diverse and we want it to be inclusive. So it's a fine way to start, but every chapter founder is very intentional about that effort. All voices matter. We recruit keynote speakers who aren't the most credentialed, but they have important stories to tell. And that's another powerful mindful mornings. They might not be the top 40 under 40 in your town. They might not have written a book, but they've got something, a story to tell. And we also coach them. So there's a robust package for each keynote speaker, and each founder coaches them on the creation of their keynote through the packages that I've created, because that's another skill of mine, is keynote coaching. We're free and volunteer run, which is terribly important. We listen, but not too much. So we're always asking our communities through surveys. We just got done with a focus group too, of the broader Mindful Mornings community, about what they need and why they're there, of which the main answer is always, we want each other, which I think is so sweet. Like we want community. I want to know that there are like mission to others in this room. And then I also want to understand what I can do. But so we listen to them, we ask them, but we don't listen too much, right? I don't say, hey guys, what do you think about this idea, over and over and over again, to the point that it paints me as not being able to make decisions, or I have an insecurity in the place in which we're going. So there's a fine line between listening, but then listening too much and not doing. And I think that, we say thanks. So I send thank you cards to everybody all the time. If they spoke, if they took photos, if they provided food, if they said a nice thing, it's a thank you card, a thank you card, a thank you card all of the time. And then we share the love. So we have a professional photographer at each one, and those photos are shared with everyone that was there in support and in partnership. Not every human being, not every 160 folks, but the people that provided food, the people that provided kombucha, and we ask them to share that love out too. So I know I'm running over, but I wanted to share those things, because for me, that has been some of the secret sauce as to why it's successful, above and beyond the way we've marketed it and the lack of announcing the speakers and that kind of thing.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Becky. And as I said before, please visit Becky. Here are the ways that you can contact her, both through the website and personally. And you'll be able to look at this recording on Facebook, and we'll send you a link to the full recording in a few days.
And if you
Thank
have
you,
other
everyone.
questions, please email me.
Yes.
I'm happy to field them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and look for the next newsletter from the Charter so you know what our next webinar is. Have a good day and a good week. And thank you again, Becky.
Oh, happy to be here. Thanks for listening.
Okay, bye.
Bye, y'all.